Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Benka, as you heard earlier. I'm going to be starting off with this is our first module, looking at the transition to land. So to dive into the fossil record, what we have to really do is think in terms of something called deep time. And this is really considering time in terms of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. And when dealing with the rock record, it's almost hard to get one's head around that. So here we have an illustration by an artist named Ray Troll, who basically depicts here the different periods of the geologic area, the Phanerozoic era, which is when the history of multicellular life on Earth is concerned. We're going to be spending in a lot of this module today, we're going to look down at about 470 million years ago during the Ordovician period, around the middle of the Ordovician period. This is a time that is when invertebrates, animals without backbones, dominated the world's oceans. We had no land animals yet. Very different planet. So you had basically the relatives of modern squid and nautilus as the dominant ocean predators, not fish with bones. On land, things were quite different in as well as the oceans. In one of the things that we really are looking at here is between land plants that we talk about and algae, there is quite a bit of commonalities. So all green plants, as we call them, not as sort of a common layman's terms, is considering all green algae and land plants together. But land plants, that is basically our liverworts or hornworts, mosses, the bryophytes, if you will, lycophytes, ferns, and seed plants, including our gymnosperms and flowering plants, they are all their own group, their own lineage. Scientists call this a clade, and they are nested within on the tree of life, the green algae. So we're going to look at and focus mostly on this branch of green algae and their relatives. And we can see here that going back to, on this slide, 470 million years ago is really one of the dates that's going to be most important in this module. It's when our first land plants appear. Now, what were the ancestors of the first land plants like? Essentially, many of them were living, well, in the water. They had to come from the water onto land. And so the closest living relatives of our land plants are a group of green algae called charophytes. And some of these are called stoneworts that live in freshwater lakes today and survive to the present. They don't smell very good if you pull them out of a lake, by the way. So quite beautiful, but enjoy from a distance. So charophytes basically start out in the marine realm and transition into freshwater environments. And many of them, and especially over time around the Ordovician and even before, they were diversifying into these environments that were actually at the interface of land and water. So you have seasonal pools and such, much like vernal or ephemeral pools today. And in these environments, they had to evolve all sorts of traits to be able to survive in a world that was not necessarily as suitable to living. So if you're living in the marine realm or fully aquatically, and you think about it as an algae, you basically can take in nutrients and water through your tissues. You're bathing in your food, and as long as you're in what's called the photic zone, that's where light can penetrate water, you can still photosynthesize. You can also you can reproduce with no problem as an algae in a watery environment with no threat of, well, some of the things you deal with on land. So let's go into some of these as well soon. When we talked about those charophytes, one of the things that's really cool about them, and I mean from a paleobotanical or a plant evolutionary perspective, is looking at how complex they are. Many of them actually look almost halfway like a land plant that you'd be familiar with. One of the big advances that the charophytes have is that they maintain fertilized eggs on the parent plant. This is quite unusual for an algae. And basically the zygote, which is the fertilized basically egg on these charophytes is protected by basically a cocoon-like thing that looks a lot, for lack of a better term, it looks exactly like a dogfish egg. If you've ever seen some of the temperate sharks that live in the north, they actually have a very similar protective case on their eggs. It's ironic, but that you'd see it on both a plant and an animal, but it's very cool. This really serves to keep them from desiccating. And again, when I was talking about how these organisms, these algae, are basically invading these water bodies that are fresh where they dry out, they need this ability to survive. So going back to the advantages of living underwater, some of them include that you basically, well, at least, or sorry, the advantages to being on land versus underwater. So if you were living underwater, why would you want to go onto land? I mean, it's kind of the Little Mermaid scenario. I mean, why do you want to get out of the water? I mean, it's great down there. Well, there's a lot more light. If you're a photosynthetic organism, you want to get as much of that as you can, and you don't want to be shaded out by the water and the depths. You also have a lot more carbon dioxide to deal with. Remember, many plants are using photosynthesis, so they're using carbon dioxide and sunlight and water, and as well as using mineral nutrients to basically create sugars that energize and power their life. So they farm their own energy. So the more sunlight you have, the better you can photosynthesize. The other thing that's really nice and handy if you live in the middle of the Ordovician is that underwater, you've got snails and all of their relatives out, basically with the target on your head as an organism that can't move, that would be happy to eat you. And on land, there's basically no animals already. And at that, if there are animals, they're not trained or accustomed to eating you as a living algae. So there are cons, of course. Staying hydrated is really the biggest. How do you not dry out if you're on land and you're used to living underwater? Getting water too. So when you move onto land and you're an algae, you don't have roots. You're an algae. You basically have a hold fast, so you can hold on to things if you're lucky. But there's no way to mine water out of the ground if you're just coming on. So you can't provide water to all of your cells as a complex organism. The other thing too is that underwater, you have the luxury of having the water keep you buoyant and also basically allow you to have turgor pressure, because you're able to get water in and out of your system as an algae. On land, you can't do that because your water's inside and there's no water outside. So it wants to leave. And the other thing too is reproduction. It's really hard to, well, mingle, let's just say, if you're on land and your gametes swim. What are you going to do? You can't really swim on land very well. So there's got to be a way to get past that. Here's a really nice figure that Hannah Bonner, paleo illustrator, provided in one of her books, basically educating about how plants invaded land. And I really like using this, and Cindy as well, for any sort of time where we're talking about the invasion of land, because it breaks it down. So if we look here, our first step to becoming a land plant from coming out of the water is to basically create a coating. You need to keep your water internally in your body and not let it all escape. So one of the ways you can do that is covering yourself with a waxy, what's called a cuticle layer, basically this big impermeable hydrophobic layer that you can basically exude if you were an algae that had the ability to do that. So you can create your own sort of basically coat. Problem is that you've also got to breathe. So through this impermeable layer, some plants developed what are called stomata or stoma, basically pores that allow for gas exchange and water vapor exchange too. So once you've got that, you've also got to deal with reproduction as well. We were talking about how it's difficult to mingle on land if you're an aquatic organism. One of the ways that early land plants could get past this was developing also a weatherproof and waterproof coating on spores, basically reproductive units that could fly through the air and carry a microorganism, basically a micropropagule, to somewhere else without them drying out. So having that shelled case, like a little flying saucer flying around microscopically, really helps these things colonize the land and spread further. Another aspect that's important to think about, and we won't talk as much probably about this in terms of complexity in this module, but the last concern is getting water from one place to another in the body. And when algae first were coming onto land, they didn't really have a very good plumbing system of transporting water and nutrients from one tissue to another. So over time, if they wanted to get larger and get further away from water, they were going to have to grow more complex tissues to accomplish this feat for moving water through their system. So the very first of the plants, as we see in the very bottom right corner of this picture, are mainly the bryophytes and their relatives, were some of the first true land plants. Now, how do we know anything about any of these early plants? I mean, this was a long time ago, about 470 million years ago. Well, it turns out from the Middle Ordovician, we have several different lines of microfossil evidence. We have three forms, namely spores. We also have tubes for conducting water through tissues. And then we have cuticles, those waxy layers for protecting the epidermis of the plant from losing water. We have these in the fossil record from this time. Here's a little bit more specifics in terms of those lines of fossil evidence. The spores come in a variety of different orientations, and some of these spores are naked, so they'll come in a variety of either being 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4, or a large sort of propagule spore. So we call these monads, dyads, tetrads. And they can be either naked or they can be coated in a membrane, depending on which group of plants produce them. And these cuticles that we were seeing in the early stages of land plant colonization did not yet have those stomata or those pores. So they were not necessarily breathing so much through most of the body plan. We weren't seeing evidence of that. So many of these sorts of spores, or these spore and these tube and cuticle fossils, are associated with what we call nonvascular plants. These are plants that don't have that plumbing. And today's modern representatives that we have are the hornworts, the liverworts, and the mosses. And many of these sorts of lineages were already probably around in tinkering by the time we start seeing these sorts of evidence in the fossil record. So one of the first spore producing organs were found around the Middle Ordovician in Oman at the time. And these spores being found in these organs show definitively that there are plants with liverwort affinities around in the fossil record very early on. So when we look at modern liverworts, we really need to think back to how long these organisms have been on this planet and have been diversifying into different environments. It's quite remarkable when you look at them. One of the traits of their spores that we see in the fossil record is that they release them in tetrads, which is clusters of 4, which are a product of the process of meiosis, basically breaking down a diploid mother cell into 4 haploid daughter cells for reproduction. And here we can see a section spore wall as well to help inform the liverwort affinities, I believe. So the appearance and abundance of different types of fossil spores changes over time. And here we have a chart here that people who study fossil spores and pollen, palynologists, use to look at abundance over time. When we look at the base of this chart, we're in the Middle Ordovician, and moving toward the top, we get up to the Middle Devonian period. So this means that the numbers just to the right of those time bins are the numbers of years, millions of years ago. So 468 at the bottom, 392. So we are going from the base, older, to closer to the present, more younger, if you will. So we can see that there is ecological change going on in the early stages of land plant evolution, as there are basically developments of different spore types and these diversifications of these different plant groups. One of the things that we see here in particular is a group called cryptospores. And cryptospores are basically, they're spore-like microfossils. They don't necessarily have a modern equivalent that's very close. And they're basically our best sort of evidence for the earliest fossil plants and their algal ancestors. So many of these organisms are sort of in this strange sort of intermediate zone where we have living algae from this time, charophytes and such. We have many of the living land plants today, but there's this sort of area of transition where there's a lot of extinction between then and now. And we basically have these fossils to understand the sort of steps in between the evolutionary leaps between these groups. And crypto, if you're interested, means hidden, basically, or mysterious, like cryptozoology, I guess. So cryptospores occur again in these different sorts of formations, your tetrads, your dyads, your monads. So you basically have a variety of different ways that the gametes are distributing. Sometimes you'll have basically 4 of them together or 2 together, and that might help with distributing a larger reproductive parcel across the landscape if you're dispersed by wind, as many spores are. Many of these correlate with what we call nonvascular plants that had not developed that sort of water and nutrient conducting specialized tissue quite yet. Many of these are quite mysterious, but we'll talk about some of these very soon. And also, in addition, the hornworts, the liverworts, and the mosses have many of these sorts of traits as well. They're sort of in this realm. So the earliest examples of those tubes I've mentioned a few times, which are conducting water and nutrients, come from fossil record looking very similar to modern highly specialized mosses. So Polytrichum, our hair cap, very large giant mosses today, have specialized water and nutrient conducting tissues through their system. They're not still included in the club, so to say, of vascular plants. But they're basically doing what a vascular plant does. It doesn't have all of the modifications yet to qualify for making true vascular tissue as what we call tracheophyte vascular plant. The other thing too, again, these cuticles with the no stomata, these are really a callback to liverworts that also produce these gametophytes, these mats of basically clonally expanding networks of thalli, is what we call them, or plates of basically cells. And they do have some conductance of water in their tissues, but not nearly as specialized as some of those tubes we were just looking at. But again, no stomata in this case. Now, bryophytes also have developed what are called rhizoids. We don't have any roots yet in land plants. Remember, they got to get that water from the ground somehow. And these sorts of specialized epidermal cells, they're often 1 cell thick or so, can basically penetrate into the ground, and they can actually conduct some water into the body of the plant. So this was a big advance, being able to get that. And some of the charophytes have these sorts of rhizoids too. So if you ever see Chara, the stonewort, and ever try growing it in a jar or something, which I don't encourage anyone to do, but it's kind of fun, they will produce these sorts of rhizoids into sand compulsively out of nodes. So it's pretty cool to watch. Here is some absolutely beautiful examples of liverworts from French Polynesia. And you can see that these are covered in that sort of cast and that sheen of blue-green on them is probably reflectance coming off of a very thick cuticle. So that cuticle is not only keeping the water in, it's also helping protect against ultraviolet radiation, which was plentiful in a landscape before shade was invented. So we can see that waxy coating today on these plants. So we've been mostly focusing on the embryophytes, the early land plants here, down toward the base on the left side of this tree of life, essentially. And we can see where this correlates with the Ordovician. So right now I'm going to conclude module 1 with a few take-home points about what to really think about with these early plants. The first thing if you can remember anything about this, is that the closest relatives of land plants are freshwater algae. And in fact, our land plants are really a division of freshwater algae that have become highly modified for living on land. So when we talk about algae, we need to also remember that we're also kind of talking about land plants too, if we want to be really including the most recent common ancestor and all of its descendants on the tree of life. So the earliest land plants appeared around that magical 470 million years ago, which would have been a pretty fun time to see things going on. Most of these plants, or at least everything that we see at that point, was non-vascular. So it did not have very specialized water conducting tissues. And they remain very similar morphologically and in body plan to our bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts for all purposes. And based on the fragments found in the fossil record, our first land plants were characteristically small, and they lived in pretty moist environments, most likely. So they would have had to have been small, low statured, close to the ground, where they could maximize their surface area for uptaking water. So with those take-home points, I'd like to open up for questions.